By the time Annie Bell rode the black stallion into Mercy Crossing, her skirt was dark to the knee with foaling blood, and the horse under her still had one eye rolling white. Men stepped off the boardwalk outside Pike Mercantile to watch, because there was not a soul in that town who believed an Indian girl and a half-broken stud ought to reach Main Street alive, much less together. Annie leaned low over the stallion's neck and said, not loud but certain, "Easy now," the same way she had said it to the mare in the barn an hour earlier, while Ruth Bell tried not to die in the room beyond the kitchen. The morning smelled of damp dust, horse sweat, and coffee drifting from the hotel stove. A freight wagon clattered past the well. Somebody laughed too softly to claim it. Annie did not waste a glance on any of them. She swung down, wrapped the reins once around the hitch post, and went up the doctor's steps 2 at a time, her palms stinging from rope burn and birth work and too little sleep. If you're listening tonight with your hands busy and your house settling around you, tell me where you are. I always like knowing how far a story can travel before it finds the people who need it. Dr. Sloan opened the door in his undershirt, silver hair up on one side and his spectacles crooked. His eyes went first to the blood on Annie's sleeves, then to her face, and all his own sleep fell away. Not mine, she said. Her breath came raw and cold. Ruth's. He did not ask another question. He pulled on his coat while she stood in the doorway, dripping the dark of the barn onto his clean boards. Behind her, across the street, Harlan Pike had come out of his store in a fine vest too early for any honest business. He rested one hand on the porch rail and watched Annie the way a man watches a gate he expects to sag if he waits long enough. She had hated his face since she was 10 and old enough to understand when kindness turned thin. The ride back was harder because the sun was up, the stallion knew the road, and the doctor was heavier than urgency looked from the porch. Still, Annie let no one else take the reins. The Bell place lay 3 miles south of town where the red earth sloped toward a spring lined with cottonwoods, and in August, when the creek sank to cracked stone and bitter puddles, that spring still ran cold enough to hurt your teeth. Ruth always said the place survived on that water and on stubbornness, and Annie had never been able to tell which of the two she respected more. The mare in the foaling shed was standing when they arrived, damp-sided and trembling, her new colt folded under her like something still being decided by the world. Annie spared one quick look, saw the colt breathing, then ran for the house. Ruth Bell had kicked the quilt half off in the night. The fever had burned the soft parts from her face and left her cheekbones sharp as handles. Her gray hair stuck to her temples. Yet when Annie knelt beside the bed, Ruth's hand came searching over the coverlet until it found Annie's wrist, as if even now she could tell her by touch. "You got him," Ruth whispered. "Of course I did. Full. Alive." Ruth gave the ghost of a smile. "Knew you'd save both." Dr. Sloan moved Annie aside and listened, felt, frowned, asked for hot water. Annie fetched it. She split kindling. She held the basin steady. She watched the doctor's mouth settle into the shape he used when medicine had arrived after the only useful hour. All the while Ruth's breathing snagged in her chest like cloth on a nail. At noon, when the doctor stepped out to wash his hands on the porch, he told Annie the truth without softening it. "It may be tonight," he said. "Maybe sooner." The boards under her boots felt hot enough to char through. She stared toward the barn, where the black stallion had gone quiet, and the new colt was trying his knees against the world. "She was feeding hens yesterday. So was my brother the day before he died," the doctor said gently. Bodies are poor judges of timing. Inside, Ruth slept for an hour, then woke clearer than she had been in weeks. That frightened Annie worse than the fever had. Clear moments were for farewells, and the room already felt as if it were pulling away from her inch by inch. "Under the cedar chest," Ruth said. Annie looked up. "What?" "Board under the cedar chest. Pry it." The board came up with the claw end of the hammer. Beneath it sat a flat tin box wrapped in an oilcloth that had once been blue. Annie carried it to the bed. Ruth's fingers shook when she touched the lid. "I meant to give it sooner," she said. "Then I kept thinking there'd be a better time." "There's still time." Ruth closed her eyes once, brief as pain. "Girl, don't waste breath comforting an old liar." Inside the box lay a bundle of papers tied with faded ribbon, a narrow strip of beadwork stitched on soft worn buckskin, and a small brass brooch Annie had seen Ruth wear only once, years ago, to church on Easter. The beadwork was blue and white and old enough for the hide to have gone dark with handling. In the center, worked in patient little shapes Annie could not read, was a pattern she had known all her life without knowing from where. It landed in her chest like a stone dropped down a well. Ruth watched her watching it. "You were wearing that when I first saw you," she said. "Not as a sash, tied to what was left of your dress. You were 5, maybe 6, quiet as frost. Wouldn't answer to anything we said." Annie did not move. The room had gone close and strange around the edges. "There was sickness up near the agency," Ruth went on, voice wearing thinner. "Families broken loose from one another. Camp half empty by morning. Your mother was gone by the time I reached you. A Quaker woman there wrote down what she could. She said your name once. I made her say it twice. I was afraid I'd lose it before I got home." Annie looked at her then. Truly looked. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Ruth's mouth worked before sound came. "Because men in town had opinions about what belonged where. Because I had no husband left by then and no son grown enough to stand in a doorway and make them mind themselves. Because the school men had started asking questions about children. Because I was selfish enough to want to keep you." Her eyes filled but did not spill. Because Annie was easier to defend than the truth. The words struck in quiet places. Annie had always known she was not born a belle. She had known it in the mirror, in the dark of her hair, in the old tune she sometimes woke with in her head and could never finish. But knowing a door existed and having it opened under your feet were two different miseries. Ruth touched the beadwork with one finger. "Your real name is Topsana." Annie said nothing. The name moved through her like cold spring water through dry ground, finding cracks, waking roots. "I never forgot it," Ruth said. "Not one day. Even when I called you Annie to keep this town's hands off you, I never forgot it." Something in Annie's throat tightened until it hurt. "Does it mean anything?" Ruth smiled a little. The Quaker woman thought it did. She didn't know enough to be sure. "I reckon the sound was worth preserving whether any white tongue ever understood it or not." There were more papers in the tin. A receipt in Ruth's name. A note with Harlan Pike's clean signature at the bottom. A few lines from the Quaker woman, dated years earlier, naming a child found near the Washita among scattered camp families after a sickness run and giving, in uncertain spelling, the name Topsana. Annie read that page 3 times, though the letters blurred worse each time. Near sundown, Harlan Pike came out to the Bell place in a buggy polished bright enough to show the sky. He removed his hat in the doorway and wore grief the way some men wore Sunday black, correctly, without feeling burdened by it. "Doctor," he said softly. "Miss Bell." No one had called Annie Miss in town more than twice in all her life, and both times there had been a joke following after. She should have known it once he had come for business. Ruth roused when she heard his voice. Her face altered. Not fear. Not quite. Something flatter and older. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. He crossed the room with slow, polished steps. "I heard you were poorly. I only wished to pay my respects. You can pay what you owe me by leaving." Dr. Sloan shifted, but Annie saw the quick look Pike gave the tin box on the chair beside her knee. Saw his eyes measure paper the way a buyer measures fence line. He smiled as if he had not looked at all. "There's the matter of your note," he said. "No hurry tonight, of course. But in the event I die," Ruth said, "you can wait until the dirt settles before you start fingering my house." His expression did not change. "The bank has procedures." "The bank," Ruth said, and coughed until the whole bed shook with it. Annie stood. "Get out." Pike turned to her then. Really turned. And his voice went to that soft place men use when they mean to insult a person without having witnesses able to object. "My dear girl, if Mrs. Bell passes before the note is cleared, there'll be legal questions. You understand that. I understand a vulture when I hear wings." For one brief second something hard showed in him. Then it was gone beneath the smoothness again. He set his hat back on his head. "Tomorrow will do, then." Ruth died before dawn with Annie's hand in hers, and the beaded strip tucked under the pillow like a promise nobody else could steal. The day after a burial has a sound all its own. Not silence. Silence would have been mercy. This was the small, relentless noise of a world that had not noticed enough had ended. Chickens scratched the yard. Wind eased through the cottonwoods by the spring. Someone in town hammered on a storefront sign. Annie heard every board in the house settle under the new weight of one less breath. She fed the stock because stock did not care for mourning. She salted the mare's mash. She wrapped Ruth's cups in newspaper and put away 2 place settings instead of 1 because seeing only one seemed worse. By noon she had washed the floor, changed the bed linen, and discovered that labor is the meanest form of hope. It keeps a body upright by lying to it about what comes next. Eli Mercer arrived carrying a sack of horseshoes over one shoulder and an apology on his face. Didn't know what else to bring, he said. Eli owned the blacksmith shed at the edge of Mercy Crossing and lived alone in 2 rooms behind it. He was not old, though grief had dried him out early. A war injury had left one hand stiff in the cold and one leg dragging a little on long walks. The town treated him kindly because he was useful and left other people's business alone. Annie had liked him for the second reason long before she admired him for the first. "You can put them in the tack room," she said. He did, then came back and stood awkwardly in the kitchen while she poured coffee because he did not know where his hands belonged in a house with fresh morning. She saw then that his collar had been brushed clean and his beard trimmed, and understood with a quick, private ache that he had prepared himself before coming. The way decent people do when they know sorrow is waiting at the door. "I'm sorry about Ruth," he said. She nodded. After a while he said, "You eaten?" That seems to be all anybody in town wants to know. That didn't answer it. No. He sat without asking and cut half the loaf on the table as if he had some authority there. "Then sit down and pretend for my sake." She should have told him to mind himself. Instead she sat. They ate in the kind of quiet that isn't empty. Through the window the spring shone between the trees, a line of steel in the light. Eli looked toward it once, and then away, careful. "Pike's been talking," he said. "Of course he has. Says Ruth's note comes due Saturday." Annie put her bread down. She paid on that note every quarter. "Doesn't mean he won't find numbers to say otherwise." Eli rubbed his stiff hand against his thigh. "He wants the spring. Everybody knows it." He was right. The Bell Spring held through dry months when other water went gypsum bitter. Freight men watered there. Drovers paid a fee for stock. If the new North Road swung closer to town, that spring would be worth more than half the houses on Main Street together. "There's a buyer coming through next week for remount horses," Annie said after a moment. Ruth had 6 near ready. "If they sell, maybe enough." Eli watched her, not the table. "You don't have to stay for that." "Yes, I do. You could take those papers Ruth left and go north. Fort Sill. Anadarko. Somewhere your name isn't something other people lower their voices over." She stood so fast the chair feet struck the floorboards sharp. "And leave Pike my house." "My horses?" Ruth's grave still wet. Eli did not rise. "I didn't say it would be the easy choice." "Then don't offer it like kindness." He took that and did not defend himself. After a breath he said, "All right." She turned from him and braced both hands on the sink. The metal was cool. Outside, a colt whinnied for its dam. She could smell the damp leather of the halters drying by the door, the last of Ruth's rose soap in the dish, with smoke caught in Eli's coat. Everything in the room felt too immediate, as if grief had skinned the world and left the nerves bare. "I heard it before, you know," she said finally. "Heard what?" "My name." He waited. "In dreams, maybe. In the way a song gets stuck in your ear and you can't remember where it started." She pressed her thumb into the grain of the windowsill until it hurt. "Topsana." He said it carefully, giving each part room. Not improving it. Not shrinking it. "That suits you better." She laughed once without humor. "You don't even know what it means." "No." He looked at the rope hanging by the door, the one Ruth used for leading troublesome mares. "But a buried name still pulls on a person, same as a rope remembers the post." The line landed so softly it almost missed being a wound. She turned back. Eli's face had gone distant, not with pity for her, but with memory for himself. It made him easier to answer. "My easier path," she said, quieter now, "would be to hitch up the wagon, take Ruth's papers, and let this town decide it was right about me all along. That I was temporary. Useful around a barn, maybe, but not fit to own the roof I sleep under." She shook her head. "Ruth took me in when she had every reason not to. She taught me to read contracts and ride colts and doctor a mare in a cold rain. I don't give that up because Harlan Pike owns a bank and a smooth voice." For the first time that day, something like respect moved across Eli's features without being hidden. "All right," he said again. "Then we shoe the 6 and make them shine." The next 3 days went by under pressure, like weather waiting just beyond the ridge. Annie rose before light, worked the remount horses at the line, brushed them till their coats held sun, and checked hooves with hands that had forgotten how to be gentle with themselves. Eli came each morning with tools clanking in a leather apron and left each night smelling of iron and ash. He did not crowd her. He did not talk when silence was the kinder trait. But when Pike's clerk rode out Thursday to inspect bank collateral, it was Eli who happened to be in the yard with a rasp in one hand and a look plain enough to send the boy back to town before he had finished his insolence. The town reacted exactly as towns do when a woman without protection refuses to collapse on schedule. Mrs. Peabody from the hotel brought a pot of stew and kept glancing around as if afraid generosity might stain her apron. Reverend Cale came with a tract and left with the tract unread. Two boys from the livery leaned on the fence to watch Annie work a dun gelding through side passes and turns until even they forgot to smirk. Old Jonah Price, who carried freight before the railroad had started threatening everybody's imagination, spat tobacco in the dust and said, "Ruth always did keep the best horses," which in his mouth amounted to a public endorsement. Friday night, someone cut the back corral chain. Annie heard the racket from bed, a hoof strike, then another, then the sick, wide sound of frightened horses finding space where no space ought to be. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, snatching trousers over her shift and pulling on boots with no stockings. The air outside bit cold and carried the raw smell of storm wind somewhere still miles off. In the Moonpale yard, 6 trained remounts and 3 broodmares were already pouring through the back gap like dark water. "Hey," she shouted, and the nearest horse flung up its head wide-eyed. Eli's lantern came bobbing from the smith shed where he had bedded down to guard the place. "Take the lead mare," he yelled. Annie ran for the roan mare Ruth had always used to settle the others. Hooves tore the ground, rope burned her palm, and mesquite thorns snapped underfoot. When she caught the mare's halter and swung herself up bareback, the whole herd had already broken past the south pasture and was heading toward the low draw that fed, in wet weather, down toward the red. Pike's deadline was noon the next day. If the horses scattered or broke themselves in the breaks, the Bell place was finished. She rode hard enough for the night to slap tears from her eyes. Eli followed on the mule-gated bay he used for shoeing calls, lantern gone now. Only the beat of hoofs behind her and the thin silver of moon on wire and scrub. The lead mare had one ear on Annie's voice even in fear. That was the trick with horses and with people both. You never won them by shouting what they already knew to fear. At the mouth of the draw, she saw a movement ahead that did not belong to the herd. A wagon canted crooked by the wash. One wheel off. A boy on the ground. For half a second, the whole world sharpened into separate edges. Ben Pike, Harlan's sister's son, 15, too vain for chores, too young to hide his thoughts well. He had one leg pinned under the axle. The spook team still wore harness, heads up and rolling. One more jerk, and the whole wagon would drag him into the cut. "Go after the herd," Annie yelled to Eli. Then she hated herself because she knew he would not. Ben saw her and tried to speak, but pain wrung it down to a noise. Annie reined the roan so hard the mare slid, then threw herself down into the dust. The wood smelled of sap and old grease. Ben's face had gone gray under the moon. "My leg," he gasped. "I can see it. The black case. Can you move your hands?" He blinked at her as if the question were foolish. That was good. Foolish meant conscious. The herd was already pulling away. Annie could hear the lead gelding's iron shoes striking stone farther down the draw. Every second she spent here cost her the Bell place. Every second she did not spend here might cost a boy his life. She felt the choice in her ribs like another heartbeat. Eli dropped from his horse beside her. "I'll brace the axle." "No. The team will jump." "Then talk them still." She did. Low, relentless, voice rough with dust and urgency. The team tossed and blew, but the mare and Annie's tone reached some older place in them. Eli shoved his shoulder under the wagon bed with a sound she would hear later in dreams, and Annie dragged Ben by the arms. Pain ripped a cry out of him so raw it seemed to scrape the night. Then he was free. The team lunged. The wagon tipped. A leather case slid from under the seat and struck the ground hard enough to burst open. Papers spilled into the dirt. Ben clutched at Annie's sleeve. He took it, he panted. From her Bible. Uncle Harlan did. Said dead women don't argue numbers. For one blank instant she did not understand. Then she saw the ribbon. Ruth's faded blue ribbon, muddy now, half loose around a packet of folded pages. Eli looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them had breath for the anger rising between one heartbeat and the next. From farther down the draw came the drumming panic of the herd reaching the wash. "If they take that crossing, we lose them," Eli said. Annie snatched up the packet and jammed it inside her coat. "Can you get him back? With my bad hand and a boy with a broken leg? I'll make a poor showing, but yes." She hesitated one impossible second, all her loyalties tearing different directions. "Go," Eli said. "I know the road home." She went. What followed came in hard pieces. The roan mare gathering beneath her. The first spit of rain hitting dust and waking the smell of old earth. The herd bunched at the wash where the banks had gone slick and steep. Annie swung wide, using the roan's shoulder to press the lead, gelding off the edge. He wheeled, slammed another horse, split the bunch. Good. Fear was a river, and rivers could be bent if you found the stone that started the turn. One mare went down to her knees. Annie slid off, grabbed cheek piece and mane, and hauled with both arms while mud sucked at her boots. The mare surged up. Behind her, thunder muttered out in the dark country west. By the time she got the remounts circling back toward the Bell place, her clothes were caked to the thigh, and her right shoulder felt torn half loose from its socket. But 5 of the 6 sale horses were with her. The 6th came limping in 20 minutes later, led by Eli, whose face looked 10 years older in the storm lantern light. Ben was laid on Ruth's bed with the doctor setting the leg. Annie handed over the recovered packet with fingers still shaking from the herd. Pike's note was there. So were Ruth's receipts, more of them than Pike had ever admitted existed, and a short letter in Ruth's own hand addressed to whoever had the courage to read it honestly. There was one thing missing. The Quaker page, Annie said. Eli searched the muddy folds again. Not here. Ben, sweating with pain, lifted his head from the pillow. There's another place. Annie bent over him. What place? She told Mama once, he whispered. Mrs. Bell did. Said if she ever had to hide what mattered from men who counted on papers more than people, she'd tuck it where no one who didn't love a horse would think to look. His eyelids fluttered. Under the old McClellan saddle. The one she wouldn't sell. The storm reached them at last then, rain hammering the roof, so hard conversation became something people had to fight to keep. Annie stood in the middle of the room, soaked and aching and no closer to safe than she had been at moonrise. Dawn was only a few hours off. Pike would be at the door by noon. The herd was half-lathered and one horse lame. The missing paper that could prove her first name still existed only if Ben had remembered right. And if you've ever come to the edge of a choice with both hands full of what you cannot bear to lose, you know the question that settles in. Do you keep the safer name the world can live with, or do you stand in the harder truth and pay whatever it costs? The old McClellan saddle hung in the tack room above Ruth's winter harness, wrapped in burlap against dust. Ruth had bought it off a cavalryman decades ago, used it on no horse living, and refused every offer made for it. Annie dragged it down by herself because waiting for Eli's stiff hand offended her temper. Rain snapped at the open door. The leather smelled of age, sweat, and mouse droppings. Nothing in the skirts. Nothing in the rolled blanket. Nothing under the cantle bag but an old nail and a twist of twine. Then her fingers found a hard place under the seat leather. She slit the stitching with Ruth's small pearl-handled knife. A folded oilskin slid into her palm. Inside lay the Quaker woman's page, another note in Ruth's handwriting, and the brass brooch Annie had seen in the tin box. The page was brief, the spelling imperfect, but there it was again. Topsana, child female, found near Agency Encampment South Branch of the Washita during sickness dispersal, mother deceased before record could be completed. The note beneath it was newer, written in Ruth's hand with witnesses signed at the bottom by Dr. Sloan and Jonah Price. This house, the spring, the horse stock presently standing, and all lawful earnings connected to the same, I leave to the girl I have raised as Annie Bell and who was named Topsana before I knew enough to deserve her trust. Let no man say I intended otherwise. Annie sat down hard on the tackroom floor. Rain drummed on the roof. Somewhere in the house Ben cried out once as his leg was set. Water dripped from Annie's hair to the dirt between her boots. She had imagined this moment in 100 shapes without knowing she had imagined it at all. Some fierce revelation. Some clean feeling. Instead it came like most truths do, wrapped in fatigue and pain and a tenderness almost too sharp to stand. Eli found her there a little later, leaning against the saddle rack with the papers open on her lap. Well, he asked. She handed him the note because speech had gone difficult. He read slowly. When he finished, he folded the paper with more care than it required and gave it back. Ruth had better sense than most men with bank ledgers. She should have told me sooner. Yes. She should not have had to be afraid. He nodded once. Annie looked up. That is an agreement. No, he rested his shoulder against the doorframe. Rain silvered one side of him. That's me knowing love and fear often use the same hand, and a person can spend a lifetime sorting which finger touched them first. She laughed through something dangerously close to tears. You always talk like that. Only when I'm tired enough not to stop myself. The laugh turned to grief before she could catch it. She bent over the papers, not sobbing, just folding inward with the effort of holding too much at once. Eli did not come put his arms around her. That was part of why she trusted him. He took the lantern, hung it where the light fell warm instead of harsh, and waited. After a while she said, I used to lie awake and try to remember my mother's face. Not all of it, just enough to know I hadn't made her up. Eli looked out into the rain. I stopped saying my wife's name out loud for 2 years after she died. Annie lifted her head. He kept his eyes on the yard. Thought maybe if I left it untouched, it would stay mine. Full logic. By the end of that second year, I was forgetting the sound of it. Near scared me to death. What was her name? He swallowed once. Lydia. Annie waited. He gave a small, embarrassed nod, as if admitting that hurt to another person made the hurt less dignified. There. Said it. Did it help? No, a beat. Yes. The house gave one long wind-borne creak from roof to floor. Annie glanced toward the hall, toward Ruth's room, toward the kitchen chair no one else would sit in first for months. Grief doesn't empty a house, she said softly. It teaches every board how to creak. Eli looked at her then, really looked, and something unguarded moved across his face. That, he said, is true. He crossed the room at last, not to hold her, but to crouch beside the tack bench and begin cleaning mud from Pike's ledger case with the edge of his sleeve. It had burst open in the wash, and Annie had all but forgotten it. Inside, beneath bank papers and neat columns, were loose slips marked with watering fees from passing drovers, interest tallies in Pike's own hand, and one ugly set of figures showing the Bell note carried twice over in 2 different books. He charged Ruth once through the bank and once through his private account, Eli said. Annie stared. He figured she'd die before anybody compared the numbers. The revelation did not save them by itself. Nothing that good ever arrives so conveniently. It did, however, deepen the shape of the man waiting in town with his polished hat and his public condolences. Some reckonings are not born in thunder. They are born in the moment a decent person finally sees the whole of a smaller, meaner one. By afternoon the rain had passed, leaving the yard washed clean enough to make the red dirt shine. Ben slept, white and exhausted. Dr. Sloan, on his way out, promised to speak at any hearing if it came to one. Jonah Price stopped by for salt pork, heard enough to understand, and muttered, Well, I'll be damned, with the satisfaction of a man who disliked being made a fool almost as much as he disliked corruption. Near sundown Harlan Pike arrived. He stood in the yard this time instead of entering the house, perhaps because word had reached even him that Eli Mercer was present and Ben Pike lay inside with a leg in splints. His voice carried smooth as cream across the damp air. I understand there was an accident. There was a theft, Annie replied from the porch. Pike's gaze flicked to Eli, to the open tackroom door, back to Annie. Careful. I am. He smiled. Mrs. Bell's affairs need not become ugly. Sign the spring over in satisfaction of the debt. Keep the house until winter. Take enough feed money to travel north if that's your wish. I am not without compassion. Inside the room behind Annie, Ben shifted on the bed. She knew he could hear every word. So could Eli. So could, she suspected, half the crows in the cottonwoods. Annie could have gone after Pike then with all she had. Could have thrown the ledger at his boots and named him thief. Could have told the town his nephew watched him steal from a dying woman's Bible. There was enough in her for that and more. Instead, she held the porch post until the splintered wood printed her palm and said, Tomorrow at noon. In public. Bring every book that bears Ruth Bell's name. His eyes narrowed a fraction. You overestimate your standing. Maybe. Come anyway. He tipped his hat like a man ending a pleasant call. But before he turned away, he let the mask slip enough for Annie to see the anger under it, clean and cold. It pleased her more than it should have. When he was gone, Ben called weakly from the bedroom. Why didn't you make him beg? Annie looked in at him. The boy's face had not yet learned how to hide shame from itself. Because I'm not owed his begging, she said. Only the truth. Ben lay quiet with that. If that reached something tender in you, stay with me a little longer. Give this story a like, subscribe if you haven't, and let me keep bringing you the kind of endings that leave a room warmer than they found it. By noon the next day, Mercy Crossing had arranged itself into a crowd. Towns do love righteousness best when it promises spectacle. Men in work shirts leaned against hitch rails. Women stood in twos beneath parasols they did not need. Pike had chosen the shaded side of the freight office yard. No doubt, so his clerks could bring ledgers quickly and his friends could stand behind him like furniture. Annie came in from the south road with the 5-sound remounts gleaming, the lame one walking steadier than expected on a bandaged leg, and Eli at her side in a clean coat that made him look sterner than grief usually permitted. She wore Ruth's brass brooch at the throat of her plain dark dress. Pike saw it and understood, if not the whole, then enough. Judge Haverton, who served the county badly but its paperwork competently, agreed to witness the dispute on the spot because half the town was already there and because even he knew that if Pike were allowed to swallow the Bell Spring quietly, folk would talk about it for 10 years. Dr. Sloan stood near the front. Jonah Price stood nearer than that. Mrs. Peabody had brought a chair Annie did not use. The air smelled of horsehide, hot plank, and anticipation. Pike began with sympathy and procedure. He had records. The Bell note was unpaid. The house and spring were secured against the debt. Annie Bell, being neither blood relation nor legal wife nor. Here he paused just enough to insult without naming the insult. Person of clear standing, had no authority to sell stock attached to the collateral. Your books, Annie said. He blinked. I beg your pardon. Both of them. A small stir went through the crowd. I have the bank ledger here. And the private one, Annie said. The one where you charged Ruth Bell the same interest twice. Silence can spread faster than fire when the right person strikes it. Pike recovered quickly enough to smile. A wild claim. Eli stepped forward then and laid the burst leather case on the table Judge Haverton had borrowed from the freight office. He opened it, took out the loose slips, and set them beside Pike's public ledger one by one. Watering fees, side tallies, duplicate charges, figures in the same careful hand. Haverton bent low over them, lips moving. Dr. Sloan produced Ruth's signed letter. Jonah Price produced his own witness signature and a memory mean enough to have preserved every date. Annie placed the Quaker page last, not because it mattered most in law, but because it mattered most to the person standing in her own skin. My name, she said, and her voice carried farther than she expected, before I was called Annie Bell, was Topsana. Mrs. Bell knew it. She wrote it. Dr. Sloan read it. Jonah Price saw it hidden because Ruth feared this town's hunger more than she trusted its fairness. Nobody coughed. Nobody shuffled. Even the horses held still. Pike's smoothness frayed at the edges. A child's camp note proves little, even if genuine. Ben Pike's voice came from the wagon where Mrs. Peabody had propped him with quilts. I saw you take it. Heads turned all at once. The boy was pale and furious with himself. Good. Shame, if it is honest, can sometimes do better work than pride. From her Bible, he said louder. At the Bell place. You said dead women don't argue numbers. His mother made a small sound behind him, something between grief and outrage. Pike stared at the boy as if betrayal by one's own blood were somehow ruder than fraud. Judge Haverton asked for the ledgers again. He compared dates, scratched notes, asked Pike 2 questions, and Annie 1. Then, because the evidence had become too plain even for him to fog, he cleared his throat and said, The Bell debt appears materially overstated. Pending formal review, seizure is stayed. Mrs. Bell's witnessed letter establishes her intention regarding possession. The horse stock may be sold by Miss. He hesitated. Annie saved him. Bell, she said. For the sale today? Topsana Bell for the record you write after. The judge nodded, relieved to have language handed to him like a safe plank over water. Miss Bell, there are many ways a person can be defeated. Some are grand enough to satisfy a crowd for an hour. The better ones last. What broke Harlan Pike that day was not shouting, not fists, not even the boy in the wagon calling him liar. It was the accumulation of plain things, 2 ledgers that matched too badly, witnesses nobody could cheaply dismiss, and a young woman the town had underestimated for years standing calm in the middle of her own name. By the time the remount buyer from Fort Worth stepped up to inspect the horses, Pike's authority had already begun to peel off him like cheap varnish and rain. The buyer was a hard-jawed man who trusted hooves before faces. Annie liked him at once for that. She trotted the dun, turned the bay, backed the grulla through a gate on one hand. She answered questions cleanly, neither boasting nor shrinking. When he reached the lame gelding, he frowned. "He'll hold," the man asked. He held a night stampede and came home asking for oats, Annie said. That almost made him smile. He named a fair price for 5 and a smaller one for the 6th. Annie countered once, won $2 a head, and heard Mrs. Peabody let out a satisfied breath she had probably meant to keep private. The money covered the true remainder of Ruth's debt, the doctor's bill, winter feed, and more besides. Pike did not stay to see the sale concluded. He left when Haverton asked for the private ledger to be held pending county review. No one tried very hard to stop him, which was its own kind of sentence. Men who had once laughed too softly to claim it now found pressing business elsewhere. By evening word had spread to the next settlement over that Mercy Crossing's most respectable banker kept 2 sets of numbers and lost an argument to the Bell girl. 3 days later, the county posted notice of inquiry against him. A month later, he sold half his holdings to meet demands nobody had dared make of him before. By winter he still lived in the same house and wore the same polished boots, but power had slipped its collar and gone to another yard. He had not been ruined, only reduced to his proper size. That would have been enough. But the world after a reckoning is built from smaller work. Annie paid the true debt and set the release paper in Ruth's Bible. She hired Jonah Price's grandson for stable help because the boy liked horses better than cards and needed somebody to notice. She let Mrs. Peabody use the spring one Saturday each month for travelers who could not pay, because Ruth had done the same and called it decency instead of charity. She asked Judge Haverton to record the property in the name Topsana Bell, and when he looked startled, she held his gaze until he learned the cost of pretending confusion. Eli repaired the south corral and said very little while doing it. One evening, when the heat had finally broken and the cottonwoods were rattling silver undersides in the wind, he stood at the porch rail beside her and looked north, toward the country beyond the red and farther on toward Fort Sill. "You mean to go?" he said. "Yes. To stay." She thought about that. About Ruth in the ground behind the cottonwoods. About the spring. About the name she had been given twice, once by blood and once by love. "I mean to find out whether any of my people are left who remember the sound of me from before. I mean to stand where my first name was spoken and hear how it feels there." She glanced at him. "Then I mean to come back if this place still wants me." "This place," Eli said, "would be a fool not to." The quiet settled kindly between them. Annie had learned by then that kindness, when it is real, does not arrive in speeches. It shows up with fence pliers. It waits in tack rooms. It says a dead wife's name aloud because someone else trusted you with a living grief. "Come with me," she said. He did not answer at once. That was one more reason she loved him before either of them used the word. When he finally turned, his face looked stripped of every easy defense. "I haven't gone anywhere on purpose in 6 years," he said. "Then perhaps you're overdue." He huffed a laugh. "That a proposal?" "It's an invitation. Don't ruin it by acting flattered." He looked north again, where the light was flattening gold over the far fields. "All right," he said. "I'll drive." So it was that on a morning clear enough to make every fence line look honest, Annie hitched Ruth's wagon, packed a week's provisions, laid the Quaker page and Ruth's letter together in the same oilskin, and tied the old beaded strip around her wrist instead of hiding it in a pocket. Half the town came out to watch them leave, because people who miss the meaning of a life while it is beside them can still be counted on to notice the departure. Mrs. Peabody brought biscuits wrapped in a towel. Jonah Price pretended to inspect the wheel hubs and cried into his beard when he thought no one could see. Ben Pike, legs still mending, raised a hand from his crutch and did not try to speak around his guilt. Annie saved him that trouble by nodding once as if the account between them had been settled. Then, from the shade of the mercantile porch where he no longer seemed tall enough for the boards, Harlan Pike said, "Safe journey, Annie." Not loud, not kind, only testing whether the old handle still fit the blade. Annie gathered the reins. The horses leaned into collar and chain. Dust lifted soft around the wheels. She turned just enough for the whole town to hear her without making a performance of it. "You knew me by the name that kept me alive," she said. "The one I'm leaving with is Topsana." No one answered. Nothing in that silence felt empty. Weeks later, up near the Cache Creek country north of Fort Sill, a woman old enough to have survived several governments and no longer impressed by any of them touched the beadwork on Annie's wrist and said the name as if returning a tool to the right hand. Annie wept then, not because she had been made whole all at once, but because she finally understood that wholeness had never been the price of belonging. She and Eli stayed long enough to hear family stories pieced together from memory, long enough to trade horse scents for names and names for kinship, long enough for the road back south to stop feeling like a retreat. By first frost they were home again at the Bell Spring. A new sign hung by the road in neat dark letters, Bell Spring Remounts. Under it, smaller, Eli had painted another line without asking her permission first and without misspelling a single letter. Topsana Bell, proprietor. She pretended annoyance for almost 3 minutes. Then she kissed him in the yard with the smell of cold water and wood smoke between them, and the mare Ruth had saved her last winter watched from the fence as if approving another good purchase. Years later, folks traveling the dry country would stop at the spring and find horses sure-footed as weather, a smithy running warm, and a woman who could read a hoofprint like a sentence and answer, if asked her name properly, with both of them. On late autumn evenings, when the cottonwoods turned their pale undersides to a rising wind and the last light caught the water moving over stone, she would sometimes stand with Eli on the porch and feel Ruth in the boards, her mother in the name, and the whole long road between them finally laid flat enough to walk. A true name is like water in dry country. It finds its way back, and the camera of the evening would have had nowhere gentler to rest than the two of them watching the spring run silver under the trees. And if you come back tomorrow night, I'll tell you about the widowed station cook who served one quiet stranger a burned biscuit and discovered, too late for safety and just in time for love, that he was the lawman everyone in town feared. Until then, take care of your heart and good night.